C'est bon, Eric? Bonsoir à tous à nouveau et bienvenue dans cette deuxième partie des concerts de l'atelier. Nous allons discuter avec Maria Cleary qui est là et qui a joué tout à l'heure. Bravo encore pour ce concert. Et avec Patrik Dasen qui nous a rejoint sur scène. Voilà. Peut-être une petite présentation. Patrik, vous êtes ethnomusicologue, vous travaillez à Genève. Et Maria, on vous a entendu tout à l'heure, harpiste, concertiste et pédagogue, puisque vous enseignez à la Haute École de musique de Genève. Alors on pensait commencer cette discussion peut-être en parlant de ce que vous venez de jouer, Maria, du programme qu'on vient d'écouter.
Oui, okay. So our program this evening was around music published and performed in Ireland between 1720 and 1740s or 50s. This is music that we have found that are in publications, both Irish and publications published in London, and also manuscripts from Ireland and also from Wales. So it was a combination for us. It was a difficult program to put together because there is just so much to choose from at this period. This is also a situation, a time in Ireland, to put it into his historical context, where 10% of the population of Ireland owns 90% of the land. So this is a time when Ireland is ruled by an English government, by Great Britain, and the population, most of the population in Dublin are from English descent and are Protestant. After the Cromwellian wars, we have the introduction of penal laws which have grave consequences on the indigenous population of Ireland, where people are not allowed to own land, and they are not allowed to vote, and they are also not able to practice their religion. So what's left? What is left, of course, is art, just as much as then as today, when people are able to express themselves, because we hope there will be never a time in humanity that we cannot express ourselves. So we have poetry and we have music, which are an enormous amount of expression of art in an oral tradition, which means that not much has remained since that time. So this was the context. The type of music, which Patrik very much reminded me of the other day, is not a time of jigs and reels, but it is a time of music of an oppressed nation, where there are a lot of lamentations, slow airs, and a lot of symbolism, which in some way mirrors this psyche of melancholy and an oppressed folk of the time.
Yeah, indeed. The Irish population at that time was growing again a little bit after the Cromwellian Wars. But indeed, the indigenous Irish population was reduced by at least 20 to 40% at the end of the 17th century. So at the very beginning of the 18th century, Irish nation is just starting to build up again, and they'll have other downfalls along the way, 1750 and 1850 and the rest. But it's true that it's a time where Irish culture is under duress, and it has been for more than a century, even before that. But it started even before that. But Cromwell was the Lord Protector of Ireland, and he didn't protect much of Irish culture.
How come you're such an expert, Patrik?
Well, I fell into Irish music. No, I'm not Irish,
no.
Even with a first name like Patrik.
Yes.
Some people ask me if I'm Irish, but I
You
don't do.
You could be my uncle.
1, 2, 3. I know how to say tree in Irish. So
Fantastic.
no, but I'm not Irish. I was born in Geneva, but from parents that were a lot listening to folk music. born in 71, so the first 70s, early 80s was the big time of the revival, and Irish music was very much part of it, with the Chieftains and Dudanan and Planksty and Bothy Band and stuff like that. So I started appreciating more of the more modern Irish music for sure, and I decided to study it as a scholar afterwards.
And that's amazing, because I'm just about the same age as you, and I was listening to the same music in a different country, but also I was listening to Andreas Vollenweider,
Okay.
which was such an enormous influence for the harp all over the world, and he's Swiss, of course, and but it's amazing, this sort of.
You are Irish, and apparently you went abroad to seek other influences, and I came from abroad to Ireland to actually learn more about it.
Exactly. Yes.
What I was fascinated in hearing the program tonight is it's music from Ireland, not to say Irish music.
Indeed.
It's music from Ireland that is not the one that we hear the most, and it's really nice to have programs like this, because it opens up what we can consider as music from Ireland. And it's true that nowadays it's a lot of these folk bands with jigs and reels and hornpipes, and a lot of dance music, and this more earlier music of Ireland is much less known.
And would you be able to, as an ethnomusicologist, would you be able to in some way define what sort of music we did play this evening?
Well,
Put
it's a
in
music
context.
in transition,
Right.
Because it's a time where Ireland is definitely fallen under British rule. It had started in the 14th, 15th century already, this British oppression, and it continued through the centuries. But of course, Cromwell and Elizabeth I and Cromwell after that was just devastating. And it's true that in the very early 18th century, Ireland is starting to get more anglicized. They speak less Gaelic. The cultural influence of the gentry is very much linked to what's happening in London, and not so much in Dublin or Cork or Belfast. And the Irish culture at that time is really put under pressure, and there's a huge transition. It's the start, that time, of the disappearance of the harp, and the appearance of new instruments like the violin, the fiddle, and the uilleann pipes, the
German flute,
yep,
which is
flute.
the exotic instrument of
Yeah,
the time.
exactly. So the instrumentarium, the instruments are changing, the repertoires are changing. Irish people are trying to resist, but the laws you were talking about made a lot, because if they didn't have the right to vote or the right, they actually were also, I would say, enticed not to play music or Irish music and not to speak Gaelic. So
Right.
even language and music was somehow in some form of a lawful oppression.
So
for sure.
luckily there were foreign people that came through, like Geminiani
Like Bocchi.
and Bocchi, and of course Dubourg, who worked for in the orchestra in Dublin, that were in some way able to bring their own music, so from wherever, from France and from Italy, and in some way also bring this music to Ireland, and yet also discover that there was also music there.
Mm-hmm.
And so this mix, of course, can be quite often difficult for us today as interpreters to know what to do with this music, because some of it we only have melodies, some of it we have harmony, which really speaks of that it comes from a tradition from European, Central European music with harmony and or basso continuo lines, and so it's always hard to know what balance to strike between this music.
Mm-hmm. And the influence of Scotland and the Ulster Scots and was huge also. So there's a big repertoire in Ireland that is from Scottish origin, and they recognise that also,
Okay.
even the most.
Do you play? What do you play, Patrik?
I played most
You
of
play at
what
home.
I played home, yes, for
Yes.
sure, because I play uilleann pipes. It's an
Right.
Irish bagpipe, and they play me more than I play them. To be honest, it's a very complex instrument,
Yes.
and I wouldn't dare playing in public myself. I'm more of a percussionist at the origin, and I only learned uilleann pipes to get closer to the people who were playing it and building it. We're in a workshop here, and I spent days and days in uilleann pipe makers workshops and stuff, and playing the instruments was a help to get inside the milieu, I would say. So I played it for the last 10 years, but I wouldn't be on a level to actually perform in public, for sure.
I hope sometime we could play together.
Well, that would be lovely.
I would
That
love to
would
do
be
that.
lovely. And it's true that when the harp, at the beginning of the 18th century and until I'd say the very early 19th century, tradition of the harp kind of declines, and we
Yes.
hear about the last piper.
Right.
Everyone has a different name for who was the last harpist. But everyone has a different name for who was the last harpist. But there was apparently a last one. So the tradition was actually going down, while the uilleann pipes actually appeared in Ireland, because the uilleann pipes appeared in Ireland in 1700s.
Right.
Was developed as an Irish instrument by the 1750s, so just at the end of the repertoire you played, and the pipers actually took a lot of what the harpists were in
Okay.
Irish culture in terms of repertoire, but also in terms of social position. The traveling harpists became traveling pipers, but the instrument I play kind of developed while yours kind of slowed down. But then, of course, the end of the 19th century and the revival and the national sentiment of Ireland made the harp
Yes.
reappear,
Indeed.
and now it's more alive than ever.
Yes.
Si je peux me permettre une parenthèse, peut-être
Oui.
qu'on peut en profiter, on parle là des instruments, peut-être que Maria, vous pourriez nous présenter un petit peu votre harpe et la situer peut-être ses particularités, parce qu'on voit qu'elle est construite
Oui.
d'une façon particulière.
Oui.
Les harpes modernes, il me semble, ont des pédales par exemple, celle-ci n'en a
Exact.
pas, et peut-être la situer dans son contexte historique.
Yes. So the instrument that I played today is a copy of a Welsh Baroque triple harp, and this would be an instrument that was used and played in London. Of course, one of the most famous composers that wrote for this instrument was Handel. But so thinking about putting this music in a context for tonight, I chose this instrument because each instrument, of course, we change with each instrument we have under our fingers, and it is a sound world that in some way makes me as a harpist or as a musician try to concentrate on melodies rather than harmony, and to accept rather simple harmonies, and to try to develop my right hand, which is where I play melodies. So it's a triple strong instrument, no pedals, and it's an instrument that is still played today in Wales.
Mm.
The Irish version would have been a little bit more bowed
Yes, indeed.
at the end for the
Yes.
column. The Irish harps were usually front bowed for the
Indeed,
column. This one is much more straight, but it looks a lot like the Irish harps you would see in the 1750s, 1780s representations of O'Neill and others, and with this very high-headed harp.
Indeed, yeah.
Mhm.
Which were in the court in Copenhagen. They were used always in the English court, the King's Court in London, and right across Europe. Irish harpists, of course, travelled. So
Irish harpist, and in general, there was a tradition of harp in all Europe. We tend to focalize on Irish harps
Indeed.
because it's on their flag, it's on their coin, and I
Yes.
mean, it's the Irish instrument per se.
We have really robbed it, but of course, every single culture, every African culture has a harp.
Oh
every
yeah, there are
single-
many harps for sure, but
every
in
country
Europe
has a
at that
harp.
time, a lot of people were actually playing these kinds of harps that are not proper Irish in that sense, and it's a Baroque harp.
Yes, it's Baroque harp. Yes, yes.
And the luthier who made that, he's in Wales.
He's in Wales, yes, it's a Welsh.
I was
Welsh man.
telling you earlier that the oldest harp we know of is one in Trinity College. It's called the Brian Boru harp. It's a smaller one for sure, because the ones that preceded Cromwell in the 16th, 17th century were kind of smaller. They're about that size, less strings, metal strings too. And I think the maker of the harp that is in Dublin is actually a Welsh maker.
Right.
Either Welsh or Scottish, but it also came from abroad.
Okay.
They tend to see it as a very Irish thing, and it is, most definitely. And it's the one you see on the beers also. It's the same one. But yeah, it also came from Wales.
Yes.
It's a nice touch.
Ouais. Les échanges en fait sont au cœur à la fois de la musique mais aussi de la lutherie finalement, on voit ça. Et puis aussi à la fois au cœur de vos vies personnelles, parce que vous, Maria, par exemple, vous n'avez pas étudié la musique traditionnelle, vous l'avez jouée jeune peut-être?
Very little, to be honest. I come from a family of classical musicians, and of course it's part of my culture, but it's a complex one. Complex. I am over 30 years outside Ireland. I identify myself, of course, as Irish, but feel very European. I have lived in many different European countries, and the music I play mostly is probably 17th century Italian music. So tonight was rather special for me. I don't play a lot of Irish music, and it's been a wonderful experience to have this chance to put a program together and play it in Geneva. So I'm really happy about that. And it's music that I think I'm going to play much more than I have up to now. So this is great.
We tend to forget that we tend to see like Ireland as some kind of a isolated thing, and Italy or England. The Europe in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries is just a highway of cultural exchanges and traveling musicians inside Ireland already, with the traveling harpists and then the traveling pipers and stuff, but not the travelers. The traveling there's this travelers culture in Ireland that is very different from what we call the traveling musicians. But musicians have always traveled a lot, and Handel and Geminiani and stuff, but also Irish musicians going abroad, and the cultural exchanges between European musicians at that time are much more developed than we might think.
Right.
We see countries as very isolated things that are properly Irish or properly Italian, whatever, but there's a common influence or back and forth of musicians and ideas and philosophies and
just
aesthetics.
Like today.
Yeah, of course.
We find each other here, or today I play a concert with one Swiss and one Italian, and it was probably very similar to situations in the past.
More similar than we tend to think with the historical
yes.
time past.
Yes. And maybe in that way, music is really a language that we can seriously communicate together with in many ways.
Even if there are some accents, and I like the idea of Geminiani putting Irish music to good taste, and which would imply that it didn't have it before,
right. He's the only one who knows how to do it.
Of course, but still, I mean, there's common influences and mixes. In my case, for uilleann pipes, the influence comes from the Musette de Cour, from the French court, and then it traveled to Great Britain with the Northumbrian pipes and the Scottish pastoral pipes, and then it came to Ireland to develop. There might be even a French-Irish connection more direct to that, but I mean, it was just traveling all over, and the French court at some point was so much important in its imperialistic culture throughout Europe. A lot of places were talking French, for sure, and these instruments traveled all over. The violin the fiddle is another example of this widespread influence of mixing roads.
Indeed.
for
Yeah.
sure.
J'aurais aimé revenir sur les mots de Geminiani dont nous avait parlé Davide tout à l'heure aussi lors du concert. Ce qui est étonnant, ou qui peut nous paraître étonnant aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il arrive en Irlande, il reprend des thèmes irlandais, et pour les mettre donc au bon goût, comme vous disiez Patrik, il en fait des diminutions à l'italienne.
Oui.
C'est peut-être des choses qu'aujourd'hui on n'oserait peut-être pas aujourd'hui aller aussi loin dans une patte sonore, s'approprier un répertoire avec un background qu'on pourrait avoir qui serait complètement différent. Comment vous vous situez comme musicien d'aujourd'hui par rapport à ça finalement?
Well, this is something very, very complex, because nowadays we talk about informed practices, which means desperately trying to understand perhaps the situation of Geminiani when he was alive, which of course we never can, because we have no recording of him. We have his descriptions, we have tables of ornaments, and he of course tried to leave some sort of trace of his style or his intention. And our work as performing musicians in 2023, a long time after his demise, is to try to understand this as much as possible, but more than anything else to put it into its context. So not only a musical context, but its extra musical context. So we have this idea of good taste, of course, we can find right through all the arts at the time. So from visual arts, from how one moved, how one spoke, how one wrote, how one, of course, if we go back a little bit further than Geminiani, we have il cortigiano, how to be a man, how to court a woman, and a whole way of being in life in an artistic way and a beautiful way. So what I do as a musician is I try to understand as much as possible about the period, and not only of course about the text. The text is sometimes rather poor. Musical notation is an incredible language, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And one of the things that I do personally is I try to play as much as possible of one composer, and then I get some sort of feel. Of course, this is extremely subjective. Maybe I'm completely on the wrong road. But of course, that's one of the beauties of being an artist, that we have time to dedicate to this, and in some way it's nearly a meditation, living and breathing a score or a composer or a collection of music, and seeing what happens, particularly with an aspect of appreciating that it's not complete. So I have the possibility, but more than anything else, the responsibility as a musician today to make decisions, even if they're the wrong ones. And maybe tomorrow I will decide to change it, and I will go on some other sort of road, and perhaps that one is also wrong. But I will try to express and try to dedicate myself to find some sort of solution and an understanding, which then of course I try to communicate as an artist with the public. And so this is part of our wonderful life, which of course you know all about as well.
Well, I'd say the relationship musicians have had with the score is much more inherited from the 19th century, and some relationship between composers and performers that were not the same people. More earlier music might have been less hooked on the score itself. There was an orality that was immense. Many musicians would actually at least articulate the music differently with ornamentations and flourishing, if not improvising, like you did during the concert, even with some humor, as we had a couple times. And it's an image of early music that we tend to reinstate nowadays. And I think that early music practice or performance has changed in the last, let's say, 20 years, maybe 25.
Yes. Changing all the time.
Yeah, of course. But before it was more strict to stick to some kind of formal analysis of text, and with less the idea that the musicians, even at that time, would have implemented in that music a personal touch, a personal taste, a personal envy, and sometimes they would maybe laugh together of what they're doing, because they would turn something in a different way and just laugh about it, and something more natural or more organic in the way to approach the musical text. And it's something that I think is very creative for early music nowadays, is that it has been somehow freed from this kind of scholarly approach to it, and it's a much more artistic approach to it, and I think it's going a righter way. If it's always wrong,
yes, it's
but it's
exactly
as you said, it's always wrong.
always
But I mean, I think it's going in a
Yes.
righter way than
Yes.
it might have been performed in the 80s or 90s,
right.
in a much more square form.
Perhaps. I mean, it's about accepting that whatever has remained as notated music or published music or even manuscripts is the act of a composer or performer of any period. It's the last act, because the person has clearly conceived the music, has played it, and then of course what is left is to pass on to somebody else. So already it's part of a process, and then we nowadays as artists or musicians, this is the only bit we take. So we've lost the conception of the music, and also the perhaps the interpretation of the musician performer at the time. So what can we do? Well, we can try as much as possible to be informed, but of course the most important part of being an artist is the very moment of performance, is that we have our own energy and our own desire to communicate, and we also have a public who react, and thanks to the public we can also change music all the time. And of course the first first musical instrument is a space, and tonight we've had such a wonderful space full of wood and feeling of, without a luthier we would not be able to play anything. So that's the most important bit. So thank you very much for this space, Robin, and thank you for the audience for being here, and this has really been wonderful for us. Thank you.
And for me it was, thank you for inviting me, first of all.
My goodness.
We are
Pleasure.
actually
Honored.
colleagues in the same school,
We are.
and it's the first time we meet in the flesh, and it's a great
And
thing.
friends forever.
Yes, for sure, for sure. We have a lot to talk about in the future years, for sure. It was a nice discovery for that, and for me it's really opening up my Irish music perspective also, because I was more into the repertoires of the revival and groups that were playing music like Irish music was never played before. The Irish music we listen to today, through the bands like Altan and the more ancient ones like Planksty or the Buffy Band, they were playing Irish music like pop bands of their time, amplified in a set with one bouzouki, one uilleann pipe, one flute, one violin. Uilleann pipes were never played like that. It also demands a change of the instrument, because then you have to temper it and you have to tune it, and they have to be played all together tuned, and for makers, tuning an uilleann pipe is some kind of headache, but the new way of playing it demanded to the makers to actually change their art to adapt to what the public actually wants and reacts to. And by the 1970s, 1980s, music was a tempered 440A thing, and then the pipes had to stick to that. The more ancient pipes were actually built on size. You had 13-inch, 15-inch, and 15-inch gives a sound somewhere around B and B flat, but neither of them. So and that you can't play that with anyone else. So the modernity of the music has tended to standardize it, and for ancient music, I guess, also playing it in modern setting might have standardized some tunings and some temperaments, but not many indications on temperaments and tunings. And do you have different tunings for the harp at that time?
Yes, absolutely.
That you applied on this one, or?
Yes, also some of them. But one of the most usual quotations in harp methods was always to take the A from the closest violin. And I do that quite regularly, both at home and also in concerts.
And so here we have the closest violin taking from the harp. On the other.
Great.
Oui. Merci. On va peut-être ouvrir la discussion aux questions du public. Si vous avez des questions, qui peuvent aussi concerner Davide qui est là parmi nous, juste à côté, je lui laisserai ma place s'il a besoin de répondre sur quelque chose de plus particulier pour le violon, donc n'hésitez pas.
Posso posare une question a Davide? In italiano, così facciamo traduzione in quattro lingue. Sì, è una domanda sul suono del violino. Perché io ti ho sentito suonare altre musiche, tipo Vivaldi o Biber, su video, e ho sentito un musicista, un violinista di musica barocca italiana, con il suo suono, e lì stasera sento un altro suono, tanto bello come l'altro, però molto diverso. Il violino non lo potrei anche non riconoscere, forse perché adesso stasera è in live, però è nel vivo, però mi sembrava che tu suonassi in un modo molto diverso. Se è giusto questa impressione, è perché questo repertorio ti fa suonare in un altro modo, naturalmente, o sarebbe forse l'idea che ti fai di un suono irlandese, del violino irlandese?
Fai attenzione cosa dici,
L'ho sentito molto denso, molto largo, con l'arco più nella corda, con un modo più semplice di suonare, pure. Non so se è vero.
Rispondo in italiano o in inglese? Cosa è meglio?
Come vuoi, non lo so.
Come quieras.
Non lo so. Non lo so. Ci sono delle cose alle quali si reagisce con l'intelletto e ci sono delle cose che si reagisce con il corpo. Io credo che quando suono con Maria, ma a seconda dello spazio dove sei, a seconda sì, anche dello strumento, ovviamente c'era Sushant con il flauto, il corpo cerca una balance, almeno il mio corpo, questo è quello che cerco di fare, per cui qui c'era bisogno di una balance che era specifica per questo posto, e allora sicuramente appunto con l'arpa, che è diversa dall'arpa italiana che di solito usa, che è più sonora, è più piena, e allora mi viene voglia di fare più note, più suono, eccetera. La musica irlandese sicuramente chiede più semplicità, mi pare, però ci sto pensando adesso. Quando sono lì la faccio e basta.
Magari perché è una situazione intima, e magari
certo.
anche proprio questa idea di suonare anche per noi stessi,
certo.
In cui proprio è una situazione anche dell'epoca, qui suoniamo per noi stessi ma anche gli altri, e in una situazione dell'epoca sarebbe stato anche molto bello se tutto il pubblico suonasse anche, quindi magari dopo possiamo
jam
suonare e fare un jam session.
Certo, ma questo porta all'idea che la musica è comunicazione, per cui se tu comunichi, il good taste, il famoso good taste, è il fatto che tu ti adatti anche alla situazione, per cui se questo è il good taste di adesso, è questo, allora uscire con un altro suono forse forse è quello che io in questa sera ho valutato good taste per me. Per cui forse è questa anche l'idea, che il good taste secondo me è una cosa variabile, non è assoluto. Il good taste cambia se io sono un italiano che vado in un posto e allora magari nel periodo del Settecento il good taste vuol dire qualcosa. Se il good taste al giorno d'oggi per me è cercare di trovare qualcosa che sia più simile alla musica irlandese per me e non fare l'italiano che suona la musica italiana, ecco, quello secondo me non è good taste questa sera.
Quindi Geminiani è stato raddolcito?
Raddolcito, forse sì.
Come anche te.
Forse sì, forse Geminiani e anch'io ci siamo raddolciti per essere più semplici, più sì, forse è una bella espressione.
Moi j'avais une toute dernière demande pour Maria. J'aurais aimé qu'elle nous parle un tout petit peu plus, comme ça, comme un clin d'œil de la pièce de William Byrd qu'il y avait dans le programme.
Ah, ok.
Et nous explique un petit peu la place de cette pièce, et que je trouve assez touchante.
Somebody was telling you something. So this piece by William Byrd is called Colin Koshurame, which means we have, of course, it's written in a how you pronounce it, but actually when you say it out loud, it is an Irish phrase, and it means the girl who either comes from or lives from or lived beside the river shore, and this piece is of course is quoted in a work of Shakespeare, and so it's a wonderful example of a piece we know existed, and we also have the music for it. And William Byrd wrote these variations, these passaggi, these divisions on this tune, and I was born beside the river shore.
But she's not the age of Shakespeare.
Nor William Byrd.
No.
So it's a special piece for me.
Merci beaucoup.
The one that was special for me was the last Chacon. I was really surprised.
Schmelzer.
I mean, it has, when you started it has this Irish air sound to it and the melody to it. And I was wondering if it was you who had made it like that on purpose. And we were talking about it with Maria, and she said, no, we actually played how it's
The
written.
piece is the melody is Schmelzer melody. So
Yeah. And it's not related to Ireland in any way,
Not
but
that we know of.
the stereotypical image we have of an Irish air kind of sounds like that, and then
Yes.
it goes away a bit, but
It does, yeah.
there's
Yeah.
this part in
Well, there's this strong relationship on a harmony between the tonic and the sixth chord, and of course this sounds that can make things sound
Mhm.
pentatonic and modal.
Mhm.
So
well, it's like these jokes about pentatonic scale, that if you play just the pentatonic scale, it seems Japanese, and if you put
Asian.
ornaments, it can become Irish.
Mhm.
yes, it was a famous person who said that. No? Yeah.
Your nephew.
May I have a question for Patrik?
Hmm?
As you were like a musician playing the bagpipe, no, it's
Mhm.
from Ireland, that you were doing it, and now that you hear the ancient written Irish melodies,
Mhm.
you feel like they change something, or it keeps something in the Irish popular part of the music making nowadays, or when
There are some elements. It's true that nowadays most of the music that is played in pubs or in Irish music concerts are more like dance tunes. Jigs, reels, hornpipes, slip jigs. It's more like dance tunes, and they have this kind of repeated rhythms with accents that is very different to what we hear tonight, with a more linear kind of musical expression. And Irish music nowadays is these little loops that come back again and again. You can sometimes hear it in the music, but it's still a more straightforward narration of the music. And nowadays it's more of these little tunes that turn together. One thing I was wondering, you actually made sets of tunes, which is a fairly common thing to do in Ireland. You'll take 3 jigs and you play them one after the other, or you'll play a slow air and then go into a hornpipe. You always play 2 or 3 tunes together. Was it something that was practiced at that time, or is it something you chose to do to somehow get closer to the Irish execution of music nowadays?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But quite often we, in concerts ourselves of many different sorts of music, we join pieces together.
Mm.
And it can be to do with having some sort of relationship between pieces, or modes or atmosphere, and also perhaps also a possibility of improvisation between different pieces. So you're right, we did play pieces in sets today, but actually we quite often do.
Okay.
So maybe I do it and I don't even think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's fairly common in Irish folk music nowadays to make these sets of jigs or sets of reels. One thing that transformed is this dancing part of the popular music, which is not well, it's very much danced in the dance community, but when you play it in a pub, it's rarely danced, but it still bumps. The music that I would maybe closer myself assimilate to what I've heard tonight would be the slow airs, and these the more melancholic slow airs, and these might have retained even nowadays some traces of the repertoires of that time. And a lot of pipers and a lot of musicians, not only pipers but also fiddlers and flute players, are going back to the Bunting manuscripts. That's 1789, 1790, something like that. So the end of the 18th century.
Yes.
But also the repertoires you chose from the 1724.
1724.
Yeah, something like that. So the 18th century has been collecting Irish music in written form, and a lot of musicians nowadays, especially on the pipes, would go back to these repertoires and try to make them shine again. I was telling you about this fantastic album from a piper called Nick O'Brien with his daughter, Aoife, and they've made some tunes on the Bunting manuscript of 1790 something. And it's just wonderful music, but it's fairly different to the folk music we hear in Ireland in pubs and on the records and in concerts. The music we hear today started to appear in Ireland by the end, 18th and early 19th century in Ireland. So there was really a cultural shift. The music you played kind of stopped being played in Ireland, and a new music linked also to the new culture and the still imposition of the British.
Let's start a new tradition in Geneva.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Cool.
And let's start the party.
Yeah.
Now is the time for the jigs and reels.
Yes.
It haven't been like this experiment that, well, it's not an experiment, but you know this group Taraf, the Haiduks, that they recorded the Bela Bartok Romanian dances, folk dances, but they cannot read partitions, they do it by their way. It haven't been like something like that by popular musicians in Ireland doing ancient things.
Well, some of them are getting closer to these repertoires, for sure. Most of them will just play for the fun in the public, and they might not have this kind of let's go in ancient times and research tunes, but there are more and more of those. The album of Nick O'Brien I was telling you about is one example of these, but they are not alone in that regard. So more and more nowadays, also to change repertoires, and I think there's a conscious of these instruments were also playing other repertoires than the ones we know today. So it's opening up, and that's nice too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Patrik.
No, my pleasure.
Thank you, François. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et avant qu'on danse sur des jigs and reels, qu'on joue tous ensemble, je voudrais encore remercier les musiciens, Maria, Davide, Sous-titres qui est là-bas. Bravo pour votre magnifique programme encore. Un grand merci à Patrik de s'être prêté au jeu, de cette discussion.
De rien, vous m'avez fait rencontrer une de mes collègues préférées maintenant.
Bien sûr, un grand merci à Daniel pour le son, à André pour les caméras, à Eric, à Emma, à Violetta et à Robin.
Et à François.
Merci.
François.
Et bien sûr, un grand merci à nos généreux donateurs sans qui on n'aurait rien pu réaliser ce soir. Donc vraiment merci beaucoup à eux. Et on vous donne rendez-vous pour un prochain épisode.